Thank you very much, Dylan, for that very warm welcome, and it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. I'm going to speak today about the parish of Llangyfelech and the research which underpinned the volume which Dylan so graciously advertised a few minutes ago. And I'm going to start off by giving you a locational sort of basis for the talk. I'm sure most, if not all of you, will have a general idea where Llangyfelech and Llangyfelech parish is. Well, it's there in front of you now, dominant in that part of what was the Lordship of Gower, and still is the Lordship of Gower. It was the biggest parish in the Lordship, which contained 24 parishes, but it was also the second biggest parish at one time in the former county of Glamorgan at 27,000 acres. It was only exceeded in size by its near neighbour, which you can see on the screen there, Cadoxton Juxton Neath. And being an upland parish in the main, although it had quite a number of areas which were in the low-lying part of the Lower Swansea Valley, it was divided administratively into what were termed hamlets or districts. And these were the product of the Tudor Revolution in government of the 1530s. And the two of the biggest there were Parcel Mawr and Rhyndoe Clydach, mainly, if not exclusively at one time, rural in nature, unlike Penderry and Clace, which were an intermixture of rural and industrialization in the period from 1750, and particularly in Clace, which was highly urbanized, or increasingly so, from 1750, and covered that part of the Lower Swansea Valley, which in due course became known as Copperopolis. Now, the parish that I looked at, Llangyfelech, is a very large one, as I've said. The tithe map of 1838 is one of those rare ones which is split into two, such is the size of the parish. And you can see there what I've delineated by colour, 10 of the biggest estates in Llangyfelech at that time. The three hamlets there are Parcel Mawr, Penderry and Clace. I'm not going to go through all the estates for you. I'll just mention the three biggest ones. Coloured green in 1750 was the Britton Ferry estate, even though, of course, Britton Ferry House was not within Llangyfelech parish. And then behind it, coming up second, was Pentllygare, coloured blue, which you can see there, which was very much in Llangyfelech parish. And I suppose Pentllygare House was an indigenous estate, if I could term it like that. And then coming up third was the one which is mottled orange and speckled similarly. This was the estate of the famous Popkin family, which was a very formidable family, particularly in the industrial southeast in Clace, which I've just mentioned. Then part two of Llangyfelech tithe map in 1838 was taken up exclusively by Rhyndoe Clydach. And here you see the Britton Ferry estate certainly coming into primacy, with the colour green shown quite clearly there. That estate was in excess of 3,200 acres. Pentllygare, I should have said, was in the region of about 2,800. The compact estate, which you can see at the bottom there, coloured yellow, for information, was part of the very large estate centred on the Knoll in Neath and owned in 1750 by the Mackworth family. But why did I choose Llangyfelech for both my postgraduate research in Cardiff some years ago and indeed the focus of the book? Well, it's a very large parish, as I've said, 27,000 acres, 43 square miles. It's a sizable unit for examination and dissection. You could call it sub-regional in scope. It's an upland parish, and these upland parishes are comparatively underdone in historical research compared to those in the low-lying areas of perhaps the Gower Peninsula or the Vale of Glamorgan. It was also an open parish, in other words, not the preserve of a dominant authority or landlord. And it also had, as I've shown, a dominant location within the Lordship of Gower. It had a pronounced rural-urban dichotomy. It had extensive common land and encroachments over time. And it also exhibited a complex manorial, episcopal and parochial administration. Finally, it had a rich supply of source material. Within the sub-parochial framework, it was broken down into, as I say, 4 hamlets. But I've put the figure 8 there because each of these hamlets was subdivided into higher and lower divisions, administrative districts. And these allow for very good intra-parochial comparison and contrast. There's also a very good interplay of variables that one can explore in terms of agriculture, industrialization, topography, urbanization, demography, and migration, as well as family or household size and structure. Now, the estates themselves changed over time. On the left-hand side, I've listed the top 10, beginning Britton Ferry, Pentregair, Popkin. I'm not going to go through them all. They're well detailed in the book anyway. But I just want to make the point that Badminton at the bottom is separated from the others because Badminton, being owned by the Dukes of Beaufort, sometimes gives gives the assumption that it was the biggest estate in Gower. Well, it wasn't the biggest estate in Gower, far from it. It had 278 acres in 1838. And indeed, in Glamorgan as a whole in 1873, it only had 1,200 acres. But what it had, and what was its power base, was claim to the extensive range of common land that was in the lordship in particular. In Llangyfelch parish, for example, the common land was in the region of 15,000 acres. Now, by 1850, there were some significant changes. You'll notice that Britton Ferry disappears. In fact, Britton Ferry, from a primary position of number 1 in 1750, was number 90 in 1850. That's 9-0. That was because it had to have a very extensive estate sale in 1821 to redeem a mortgage, PDQ, and it lost an awful lot of land, particularly in Llangyfelch. And that allowed other estates to emerge. Dyffryn Clydach, for example, in the Bryn Coch, Neath Abbey area, where Howell Gwyn and his father came to lay claim. And you had newcomers coming into the arena, such as Ynys Tawe and others then emerged, such as Cefn Myddfai and Bryn Wylach. Those latter two were an outgrowth of what was formerly in 1750 the much larger Gwernllwyn Chwith estate, whose power base was in Llansamlet. Now, the sources that I used were extensive, and the strategy that I adopted after some thought was to start off with a Llangyfelch tithe map and apportionment of 1838 and work backwards and forwards. Working backwards, one quickly hits the land tax assessments, which I've listed there between 1772 and 1831. And Glamorgan is well endowed with survival of land tax assessments, particularly in the lordship of Gower area. And then I won't go through them all, but I went through estate collections, which I've listed, estate maps and surveys. 2 important lordship surveys of 1650, that's the Oliver Cromwell one and 1764. And then you had Badminton manorial surveys. The episcopal surveys were also not to be ignored. They were the ones undertaken by the Bishop of St. David's, because as you all know, the Gower, in terms of peninsula and lordship, all fell within the Diocese of St. David's. Working forwards from 1838, I then looked at census enumerators returns from 1841 to 1911, sale catalogues, estate records, etc., etc. And I also took the time frame forward from the nominal termination date of 1850 to later sources, because they also reflect well on how estates grew or remained static, as the case may be. Now, every researcher should critique his or her sources, as we all know. And there were limitations with regard to the research that I undertook. For example, the tithe apportionment, sadly, had all of column 5 relating to land usage completely blank. It wasn't the only one. There are several in Gower exhibiting that pattern, I'm afraid, and there are reasons for that. Land tax assessments were generally missed in the hamlet of Clace, and of course land tax assessments don't give acreages anyway. Estate plans and surveys were patchy and fugitive, and then I won't go through them all, but the parish registers were of variable quality as well, particularly up to 1750. But the other limitation, in a sense, was that the sources themselves were well dispersed, being in Cardiff Central Library, Glamorgan Archives, the NLW, Royal Institution of South Wales, Swansea Central Library, the Richard Burton Archives, the National Archives, and the West Glamorgan Archives Service. There wasn't one particular central locale that one could happily go to and meet your full needs. You had to do a lot of visitations, which I did over the period of my research. Now, in terms of resolving the limitations, essentially I did that either through using surrogate sources or through the process of nominal record linkage. And just to give you an example, the way I overcame the tithe apportionment limitation was to use other sources to reclaim the cultivation data. For example, estate surveys, rentals, sale catalogues, ordnance survey field reference books, and land utilization maps and agricultural returns. The latter two essentially from the National Archives, as well as the National Farm Survey of England and Wales in 1941 and 43. Although that was a period a lot later than my period under review, it still reflected very well what was apparent almost 100 years earlier. So what were my findings? Well, in general, it supported the fact that in terms of the open-closed model of parochial differentiation, Llangefellach was quite clearly an open parish. It had a large number of landowners and a high degree of owner occupation. Over 120 landowners, of which 63% owned under 100 acres, and only 3 or 2.5% owned over 1,000 acres. Indeed, only one over 2,000 acres, and that was the Pentregair estate after in 1850. Only 3 landowners owned land in all 4 hamlets. The vast majority owned in 1 hamlet. In other words, there was no dominant authority, no dominant landlord to influence social, political, and cultural affairs. And in migration, non-conformity and a fluid land market were also all strong militating factors against landlord dominance. If you did a similar exercise, for example, in Rhossili or Porthainen or Penrice, first of all, you'd only have to colour the map in red or blue or whatever, because it was under the total dominance of the Mansell-Talbot family. And their policies reflected strongly in those 3 parishes. Then other findings I found, the size of farms was small to medium, which didn't come as a great surprise. I've given the mean and median sizes there. The shape of farms, essentially the majority, 65% were compact units, and a further 20% only had 1 dispersed field, and that dispersed field was very often very close to the main farm. There was a 15% figure subject to fragmentation or multi-dispersal. But importantly, there were variations within and between the hamlets. Multiple occupation was also a sizable feature. For example, 168 holdings in excess of 5 acres were subject to multiple occupation, which represented over half the total number of holdings above 5 acres. And the high incidence of multiple occupation effectively constrained supply and could have exacerbated land hunger. And it is in this context that perhaps the Rebecca Riots needs more research, particularly in the great tumult of the late 1830s and early 1840s. In terms of hereditary tenancies, I found 33 definite cases, which is a severe underestimation, I think, because of marriage and name changing. And you sometimes lose the thread very often as to continuity of tenancies. Subletting as well also hides the true extent of hereditary tenancies. The size of families were effectively just over 4.5 on a mean level, and exactly 4 when you look at it in terms of median size. When you take the household into account, it's obviously bigger, as you can see there, and the household size increases essentially in terms of the farms anyway, because of servants living in. Household structure was basically represented in the main by simple family household, although you did have 18% which could be termed an extended family size. Multiple family size, where you had essentially 2 families cohabiting, was comparatively rare, as was solitaries and no family at all. Not surprisingly, most of the majority of farmers who were heads of household, 63% were born in the parish, with a further 16% born in Glamorganshire and a 16% born in Carmarthenshire. Migration was short distance movement, which underpins the findings of Ravenstein and his theories back in the 19th century. And overall, the population growth from 1544, which represents one of the lay subsidy assessment dates, was in excess of 1,200% up to 1851, but an exponential increase in the hamlet of Cleislower from 1850. Right, looking at the findings specifically in terms of land ownership, changes of land ownership are essentially influenced by 4 factors: marriage, inheritance, sales, and purchases. In terms of marriage, I give you a few examples where estate growth occurred as a result of marriages. Pentlaguer, particularly in the 18th, twice in the 18th century, and Calvert Richard Jones, when he married one of the heiresses of the Herbert estate in Swansea in 1761, and effectively became one of the most powerful landlords, not only in Swansea parish, but in Llangavelach as well. And the Ynys-Tawr estate later on is another example of estate growth as a result of marriage. Change in land ownership can also occur through inheritance. The failure in the direct male line, for example, allowing female succession, whereby, not in every case, however, but in a number of cases, it allows husbands from other parts of the country, and when I say country, I mean on a UK level, can come into the estates and take over, in other words. And that happened with the Knoll and Ynys Penllwch in 1679, when the Evanses of the Knoll married into the Mackworths. Gwenlloyd Chwith, when Lord and Lady Leicester's time as owners of the Gwenlloyd Chwith estate came to an end and Cefn Ddyfai emerged. And then there are other examples which I've cited there. There's also change as a result of failure in the direct male line involving indirect succession, whereby the estate devolves not to an heir or heiress, but perhaps to a collateral kin, such as cousin or nephew or whatever. And that happened in several cases: Britton Ferry in 1776, Pentlaguer certainly in 1787, and Ynys Arwed, which was an estate centred in the Neath Valley, on several occasions in the late 18th century. It was only in the case of Calvert Richard Jones and the Morris estates, Morris giving his name to the Morriston area, who were consistent in producing male heirs between the period 1750 to 1850 and beyond. Sales also affected change, particularly indebtedness causing the sale. And it happened with the great Popkin estate in those dates, Britton Ferry, which I've mentioned, and also in respect of Kilvrew, which is an estate centred in Gower in the parish of Pennard. They sold a number of outlying farms in 1796-97. Ynys Penllwch was also disposed of by interfamilial arrangement, as I termed it there, when the Mackworth family married into the Capel Hunbury Lee family of Pontypool in 1800. And as a result of that union, and through family connections with the Myers family, allowed Ynys Penllwch to become part of the Myers estate from that period on. There were purchases which also affected change, quite obviously. In the pre-1750 period, there are examples in Britton Ferry, Pentlaguer, and Popkin. the purchases needn't be dramatic, they could be incremental, and that basically was, in respect of Pentregair, bit by bit approach, which built up the estate and gave it added strength in later years. Post 1750, you had a lot more examples, and the names I've listed there are essentially, if I can term them this, new entrants into the market. And I've mentioned at the bottom of that point, generally new men or nouveau riche, who were symbols of a new age, but I wouldn't want to overplay that point. They weren't dirt poor coming into the market in the first place. And some of them, such as the Gwyn family, William Gwyn, did have ancient gentry lineage, as did James Evan Bailey, who was the scion of a Scottish laird in Inverness, a plantation owner and in the West Indies, and a Bristol MP. These people had wealth behind them, but they didn't come in the main from ancient gentry stock. And I've put at the bottom there casualties in the sense of what happened to some of these estates after the First World War. And I've only listed a few there: Cefn Rhyddfai and Rheola, because Cefn Rhyddfai in due course became part of the Rheola estate in the Neath Valley. Dyffryn Clydach and Ynys Penllwch were three examples where the estates more or less sold up in the 1920s. Now, to finish off, I want to come to the important point of place names for obvious reasons. The research I did didn't have place names as the main focus, but in considering about 350 farms, it gave rise to an awful lot of place names in my research. And I just want to share with you some of the variations in some of the well-known names and perhaps not so well-known names in this part of the world, and also acknowledge the great help that Gwyneth Pearce, Professor Gwyneth Pearce, your illustrious life president, has given me over the years. And I just want to distinguish between two spellings of Pentregair and Pentregair there. Historically, and in terms of looking and examining the estate catalogues, Pentregair spelt with the suffix G-A-R-E predominates. In fact, I've never seen in the Pentregair catalogue a spelling where the more usual G-A-E-R is spelt. In fact, Pentregair is a modern connotation and emerged as the village of Pentregair in the 1890s when Sir John Talbot Dilwyn Llywelyn took positive action to create a community adjoining his principal estate. But to all intents and purposes, the estate has been spelt as is shown predominantly in the list there. Now this name gives rise to quite a lot of complexity and confusion. Nidvwch was an adjoining estate to Pentregair. When I say adjoining, it was right next to it. And in fact, the intermarriages between the two families, the Matthews and the Prices, accounted for the increase in Pentregair over time. But here I want to quote what Gwyneth Pearce said to me, and he never let me down, Gwyneth, but he had to be honest with this one. And I'll just quote briefly from the letter that he sent to me when I asked him for his views on the meaning and derivation of Nidvwch. Dear Jeff, you win some, you lose some. This one, I'm afraid, you lose. I haven't the foggiest idea about Nidvwch, or whatever. It is not that I haven't spent hours over it. I have, but to no avail. My only comfort is that no one else has seen the light either, to my knowledge, but we live in hope. I have made all kinds of allowances, brought in comparative material, allowed for syncopated and dropped syllables, etc., but cannot unravel it. Etymologically, not in any fairly recent historical sense, the uch ending savours of Goidelic word formation to me, an adjectival termination of indeterminate meaning until we have cracked that of the first element. In other words, I think the jury is still out on that one. People have come up with one or two fancy ideas, but I think we are still living in hope, as Gwyneth says. Nidvwch goes back to the 14th century, I should have said. Bryn Wylach was another name which I put past Gwyneth, and he was very pleased to get the variations that I gave him because he didn't have them all. In fact, he says in his letter, very many thanks for the Bryn Wylach references. they contain quite a few which I haven't got on my slips. I have most of the Glamorgan Record Office sources, land tax assessments, etc., but not the census ones. And then he highlights Brun Villa House here in particular. Brun Villa House is a real beauty, with Wheelach equating to villa. There's a bit of Frenchification there on that one. And that came to prominence in a sale catalogue advert of 1807 after John Landig, who owned the house, had died. Gwynedd goes on to say, would you object if I relayed some of these forms to my colleague Thomas Roberts for inclusion in the Melville Richards archive? Melville Richards may not have them all, which I was only very, very pleased to do. And he went on in his letter then to ask me about Maestir Mawr. Can I pick your brains on one thing? Maestir in the parish of Llangyfelach shows up as Bank Maestir Mawr on the Ordnance Survey map, just south of the Upper Lliw Reservoir. Don't go to any trouble, but if you should see some forms in local documentation, I would be grateful to know of them, just in case Maestir here is not, quote, open land, champion land, etc. I would be delighted if it was not, even more if it had ecclesiastical attachments to the church in Llangyfelach or the episcopal manor of place. Well, I couldn't come up with anything to help Gwynedd in his requests, except that I gave him the variations you see there, and also others which show that Maestir was used as not only an individual name for Maestir Fawr, but also alternative names for other properties in the area, such as Llety of Rhain alias Maestir Ucha, Maestir Isha alias Cwm Cyle Fawr, and Maestir alias Cwm Cyle Bach. All of those variations, incidentally, with the exception of Cwm Cyle Fawr, have disappeared by 1850. And finally, I want to bring into play the old chestnut of Twll y Gwyddel, whose literal translation has been used by many commentators as equating to the whole of the Irishman. And there's a fair bit of veracity in that. But then people go on to justify the meaning by saying, oh yes, it is the whole of the Irishman, because between 1886 and 1892, the Upper Lliw Reservoir was being built. It attracted an awful lot of Irish navvies to the area. Well, in saying that statement, these commentators are defying at least 200 years of history, because Twll y Gwyddel was prominent about at least 150, 200 years before that. And it's not to say that there isn't some veracity in the Irish aspect of Gwyddel, because where this farm is an area where Irish terms are quite clear, such as Eithrin in Clydach. But Gwynedd Pearce, in his masterly account in Glamorgan County History 2, early Glamorgan, gives an alternative name to Gwyddel as equating to forest, grove, thicket, or brake, thorny wilderness. And it's my belief that the topography of Twll y Gwyddel, particularly the heavily wooded nature of the lower Clydach Valley, where the farm is, and below the farm, would support this definition. So I think I'll leave it there. I have got a couple of things I could say on field names, but perhaps I can raise that if time allows in the Q&A. I realize that I'm close to time here. Thank you very much for listening.